On a warm June morning in 1914, a 19-year-old boy stood on a street corner in Sarajevo with a pistol in his pocket. He did not know that within 37 days, his single act would drag 6 empires, 4 continents, and 70 million soldiers into the deadliest war humanity had ever seen. He did not know that kings who called each other cousin, who had danced at the same weddings and mourned at the same funerals, would soon send their peoples to die by the millions in trenches barely a few meters from each other. No one planned this catastrophe. No single villain conjured it. It was built, piece by piece, over decades, out of pride, fear, broken promises, and blind alliances, until one gunshot was enough to collapse it all. This is the story of how the most civilized continent on Earth, armed with the deadliest weapons it had ever built, walked into the abyss with its eyes wide open and somehow never saw it coming. A golden age blind to its own doom by the summer of 1914. Europe believed itself invincible. It had not fought a general war in over 40 years, not since Bismarck's cannons had fallen silent at Sedan. Railways stretched across the continent like iron veins. Telegraph wires connected capitals in seconds. Factories in Manchester, Essen, and Lyon produced more steel, more coal, and more wealth than any civilization in human history. Kings, emperors, and czars ruled over empires that spanned the globe, and many of them were literally family. Grandchildren of Queen Victoria sat on the thrones of Britain, Germany, and soon to be Russia by marriage. It was an age of extraordinary confidence. Newspapers spoke of eternal peace guaranteed by trade, science, and reason. Few believed a great war was even possible anymore. Fewer still believed that if one came, it could last more than a few glorious months. But beneath this gilded surface, the continent had been quietly arming itself for a generation. Since Bismarck's fall in 1890, the careful, restrained diplomacy that had kept Europe's rival ambitions in balance had unraveled. The new Kaiser, Wilhelm II, abandoned the cautious alliance system his old chancellor had spent a lifetime constructing. Where Bismarck had feared nothing more than a two-front war, Wilhelm's Germany now marched confidently toward exactly that nightmare, building a navy to rival Britain's, flexing its muscles in Africa and the Balkans, and demanding what it called a place in the sun. Every great power watched every other great power with growing suspicion. And in secret, they had all begun preparing for a war they publicly insisted they did not want. The clearest symptom of this hidden fever was the naval arms race between Britain and Germany. When Admiral Alfred von Tirpitz convinced the Kaiser to build a battle fleet capable of one day challenging the Royal Navy, Britain responded not with alarm alone, but with an entirely new class of warship, the Dreadnought, which instantly rendered every existing battleship in the world obsolete and reset the arms race to zero. Both nations poured staggering sums into steel and armor plate. Each new keel laid in Kiel answered by 2 laid in Portsmouth, until naval spending consumed a share of national budgets that would have seemed unthinkable only 20 years earlier. On land, the pattern repeated. France and Germany each extended compulsory military service, each expanded their reserves, each drew up war plans more ambitious and more rigid than the last. Military planning, once a quiet department of government, had become the engine driving foreign policy itself, and the generals who drafted these plans increasingly spoke not of preventing war, but of how best to win the one they now considered inevitable. The web of alliances Europe in 1914 was not one continent but 2 armed camps, bound together by treaties that almost none of their own citizens fully understood. On one side stood the Triple Alliance: Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy, a partnership forged in fear of isolation. On the other stood the Triple Entente: France, Russia, and Britain, an uneasy coalition stitched together by mutual distrust of Germany rather than any real friendship between its members. France had never forgiven the humiliation of 1871 and the loss of Alsace-Lorraine. Russia sought a patron against Austria-Hungary in the Balkans. Britain, alarmed by Germany's growing fleet, abandoned its long tradition of splendid isolation to align, cautiously, with its old rivals. These alliances had been designed as instruments of peace, deterrents so terrifying that no power would dare start a war it could not win alone. But they contained a fatal flaw. Each treaty bound its signatories to defend one another, meaning that a local quarrel between 2 small states could, in an instant, become the trigger for a general European war. As one French diplomat and one German general staff officer both privately warned around this very time, in almost identical language, the outbreak of war depended on nothing more than a single spark. Nobody who signed these treaties intended for a Balkan dispute to summon the armies of 6 empires. Yet that is precisely the machine they had built and wound tight and left waiting. The powder keg of the Balkans. If Europe was a powder keg, the Balkans were the fuse. For decades, the decaying Ottoman Empire had been retreating from southeastern Europe, leaving behind a patchwork of fiercely nationalist young states: Serbia, Bulgaria, Romania, Greece, Montenegro, each hungry for territory, each convinced its own people deserved to be united under one flag. Into this volatile region stepped two great empires with irreconcilable ambitions. Austria-Hungary, a multi-ethnic empire terrified of the nationalist fever spreading among its own Slavic subjects, saw an independent, expanding Serbia as an existential threat. Russia, styling itself the protector of all Slavic peoples, saw Serbia as its natural client and its gateway to influence over the Balkans, and eventually, the Turkish Straits. In 1908, Austria-Hungary had formally annexed Bosnia and Herzegovina, a province with a large Serbian population that Serbian nationalists had long dreamed of absorbing into a greater Serbia. The annexation was a diplomatic humiliation Serbia never forgot and never forgave. Then came the two Balkan Wars of 1912 and 1913, in which the small Balkan states first crushed the Ottomans together and then turned on one another over the spoils. Serbia emerged from these wars nearly doubled in size. Its army battle hardened, its nationalist fervor at a fever pitch, and its secret societies. Most dangerously, a group of army officers known as the Black Hand, increasingly willing to use assassination as a political weapon. Vienna watched Serbia's rise with mounting alarm. All that was needed now was an excuse. Within Austria-Hungary's own borders, the danger felt even more immediate. The empire was a patchwork of 11 different nationalities, held together not by shared identity but by loyalty to the aging Emperor Franz Joseph, who had reigned since 1848 and had already buried a brother, a son, and a wife to violence and tragedy. Slavic peoples made up nearly half the empire's population, and a triumphant, expanding Serbia next door offered them a magnetic example of what national independence could look like. Vienna's military leadership had in fact urged war against Serbia on several earlier occasions during the Balkan crises, only to be restrained each time by the elderly emperor's caution and by uncertainty over German backing. By the summer of 1914, both of those restraints were about to disappear. A bullet in Sarajevo on the 28th of June 1914, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, arrived in Sarajevo, the capital of the newly annexed province of Bosnia, to inspect military maneuvers. The date itself was a provocation to Serbian nationalists. It was Vidovdan, the anniversary of the sacred Battle of Kosovo, a day burned into the Serbian national memory. Waiting along his motorcade route were 6 young conspirators, armed and trained with the covert support of Serbian military intelligence, members of a secret nationalist network sworn to strike a blow against Austrian rule. The first assassin threw a bomb that bounced off the Archduke's car and wounded bystanders instead. Remarkably, the royal couple survived, and Franz Ferdinand insisted on continuing his visit, determined not to appear afraid. But fate, or catastrophic misfortune, intervened. As his driver took a wrong turn and stopped to reverse near a small delicatessen, one of the conspirators, a frail 19-year-old named Gavrilo Princip, found himself standing, by pure accident, only a few feet from the Archduke's stalled vehicle. He stepped forward and fired twice at point-blank range. Franz Ferdinand and his wife Sophie were dead within the hour. Princip would later say he never intended to trigger a world war. He wanted only to strike a blow for Slavic freedom. He could not have imagined that his 2 gunshots would echo across every battlefield of the next 4 years. Vienna's fury and Berlin's blank check news of the assassination shocked Europe, but almost nowhere did it provoke the fury it ignited in Vienna. The Austro-Hungarian leadership, and above all Chief of the General Staff Konrad von Hotzendorf, saw in the murder the perfect pretext to finally crush Serbia once and for all. An opportunity too valuable to waste on mere diplomatic protest. Yet Austria-Hungary knew it could not risk a war with Serbia if that meant facing Serbia's patron, Russia, alone. Before it dared act, Vienna needed to know exactly how far its ally in Berlin was prepared to go. On the 5th of July, an Austrian envoy arrived at the Kaiser's court seeking assurances. Wilhelm II, still emotionally shaken by the murder of a personal friend, gave an answer that would prove catastrophic. Austria-Hungary could count on Germany's full support, whatever action it chose to take against Serbia, even if that action provoked Russian intervention. This assurance, later remembered by historians as the blank check, removed the one restraint that might have forced Vienna toward caution. believing Germany stood firmly behind it. The Austro-Hungarian government began drafting an ultimatum designed not to be accepted, but to be rejected, a document engineered to guarantee war. The ultimatum for 3 weeks after the assassination, an eerie calm settled over Europe. Statesmen took their summer holidays. Markets remained stable. Few outside the inner circles of Vienna and Berlin suspected how close the continent stood to catastrophe. This calculated delay was deliberate. Austria-Hungary needed time to complete its harvest before mobilizing its army, and it wanted the shock of the assassination to fade just enough that its coming ultimatum would appear reasonable rather than transparently engineered. On the 23rd of July, Austria-Hungary finally delivered its ultimatum to Serbia, giving the government in Belgrade only 48 hours to respond. The demands were deliberately humiliating. Serbia must suppress all anti-Austrian propaganda, dissolve nationalist organizations, and most explosively, allow Austrian officials to participate directly in the investigation on Serbian soil, a demand that struck at the very heart of Serbian sovereignty. To the astonishment of Vienna, Serbia, backed by quiet Russian encouragement, accepted almost every single demand, rejecting only the clause that would have permitted Austrian officials to operate within Serbia itself. It was, by the standards of the era, an extraordinarily conciliatory response. It made no difference. Austria-Hungary had already decided on war before the ultimatum was even sent, and on the 28th of July, exactly 1 month after the assassination, it declared war on Serbia. The machinery of mobilization what followed was not diplomacy but a chain reaction, a machine of treaties and railway timetables that no single leader seemed able to stop. Russia, unwilling to abandon Serbia and desperate not to suffer the humiliation of backing down as it had during the 1908 Bosnian crisis, ordered a partial mobilization against Austria-Hungary. But Russia's military planners warned the Tsar that partial mobilization was militarily impossible without chaos. The empire's vast railway system had been designed only for full general mobilization. On the 30th of July, Tsar Nicholas II, after an agonized night of indecision, signed the order for full mobilization of the Russian army, a force of over 1 million men, against both Austria-Hungary and, by necessary implication, Germany. For the German General Staff, Russian mobilization was the single most feared word in Europe. Germany's entire strategic doctrine, the Schlieffen Plan, was built on a terrifying premise that Germany could not survive a war on 2 fronts against both France and Russia simultaneously, and that its only hope of victory lay in defeating France within 6 weeks before the slower Russian army could fully mobilize, then turning east to face the Tsar. The plan left no room for hesitation. No room for a limited or partial war. The machinery of mobilization, once begun, could not be paused, adjusted, or reversed without dismantling Germany's entire war strategy. On the 31st of July, Germany issued an ultimatum to Russia demanding it halt mobilization within 12 hours. Russia did not respond in time. The dominoes, so carefully arranged over decades, had already begun to fall. The dominoes fall on the 1st of August 1914. Germany declared war on Russia, because the Schlieffen Plan demanded the swift defeat of France before Germany could turn east. Berlin now needed a pretext to strike westward as well, even though France had made no aggressive move whatsoever. On the 3rd of August, Germany declared war on France, and to execute its plan, German armies began marching not directly toward the French border, but through neutral Belgium, a country whose independence Britain had guaranteed by treaty for nearly 80 years. This single decision, born purely of military logistics, would draw the one power still hesitating on the sidelines directly into the conflict. British Foreign Secretary Sir Edward Grey had spent the entire crisis desperately trying to broker a peaceful solution, proposing conference after conference that Berlin and Vienna repeatedly ignored. But the violation of Belgian neutrality left Britain no honorable path to stay out. On the evening of the 4th of August, as crowds gathered outside government buildings in London awaiting news, Grey stood at his office window watching the street lamps being lit below and murmured a line that would become one of the most haunting in modern history. The lamps were going out all over Europe, and he doubted they would be lit again in his lifetime. That same night, Britain declared war on Germany. In the space of exactly 1 week, 5 great empires had gone to war, not because any of them had planned this precise war at this precise moment, but because none of them had found a way to stop the machine they had spent a generation building. Europe marches to war across every capital of Europe. The declaration of war was met not with dread but with jubilation. In Berlin, Paris, London, Vienna, and St. Petersburg alike, enormous crowds filled the streets, waving flags, singing patriotic anthems, and cheering young men marching off toward the recruitment offices. Newspapers on every side assured their readers of a swift, glorious, and above all short victory. German soldiers boarded trains for the front with chalk graffiti scrawled on the carriage walls, promising they would be home before the leaves fall. French officers marched in bright red trousers and blue coats, uniforms designed for the parade ground of a previous century, utterly unprepared for the machine guns and artillery about to await them. Kaiser Wilhelm II himself told departing troops they would be home again before the autumn leaves had fallen from the trees. This universal, almost euphoric confidence was perhaps the single greatest and most tragic miscalculation of the entire crisis. Not one general staff in Europe, not in Berlin, not in Paris, not in Vienna, not in St. Petersburg, had genuinely prepared for a long war of attrition. Every plan, every timetable, every strategic doctrine assumed a rapid, decisive campaign settled within weeks or months by bold offensive maneuvers. Exactly as the wars of Bismarck's generation had been decided at Sadowa and Sedan. None of Europe's military planners had reckoned with what modern industrial weaponry, the machine gun, quick-firing artillery, barbed wire, would actually do to armies attempting to advance across open ground. The armies that marched out so joyfully in August 1914 were about to discover, within a matter of weeks, that the war they had built for an entire generation was nothing like the war they had actually imagined. Ordinary citizens, too, were swept up in a wave of patriotic intoxication that historians would later call the spirit of 1914. University students abandoned their studies to enlist before the fighting could possibly end without them. Poets and intellectuals who had spent years denouncing militarism now wrote odes to the glory of national sacrifice. In every country, the outbreak of war was described not as a tragedy to be endured, but as a cleansing, unifying moment, a chance to rise above decades of class conflict, political division, and social unrest, and stand together as one nation. Few paused to ask why 5 great empires, all insisting they wanted only peace and self-defense, now found themselves marching toward one another with such unrestrained joy. Fewer still imagined that this same generation, so eager to fight, would spend the next 4 years burying millions of its own sons in fields with names the world had never before needed to remember. Ypres, Verdun, the Somme. The illusion of home by Christmas by September, the German advance through Belgium and northern France, had been halted at the Marne, just miles from Paris, in a desperate battle that shattered the Schlieffen Plan's promise of a swift victory. By November, both sides, exhausted and unable to outflank one another, had begun digging trenches, a defensive line that would eventually stretch, unbroken, from the North Sea coast to the Swiss Alps. The war of movement that every general had planned for was already dead, replaced by something none of them had prepared for, a static, grinding war of attrition that would consume an entire generation of European youth. The soldiers who had marched off in August singing patriotic songs, promised they would be home before the leaves fell, were still in those same trenches when the snow began to fall in December. Christmas 1914 found them not celebrating victory parades in their home cities, but staring across a frozen no-man's land at the very enemies they had been told they would swiftly crush. The war that Europe's leaders had assured their peoples would last only weeks was only just beginning, and it would not end for another 4 years. Consuming empires, toppling dynasties that had ruled for centuries, and leaving nearly 20 million dead before it was finally over. The Europe that had entered the summer of 1914 confident, prosperous, and utterly certain of its own invincibility would emerge from the war unrecognizable, its old order shattered forever. And the seeds of an even greater catastrophe, 25 years later, already quietly being sown.